The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Henderson's Market as Margaret Chen finished loading her groceries into the trunk of her aging Honda Civic. At 62, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to manage her limitations. The small blue inhaler in her jacket pocket was never far from her thoughts, a constant reminder of the asthma that had plagued her since childhood and worsened during her years of military service. Margaret had served 23 years in the Army, retiring as a master sergeant before the lung damage from exposure to burning oil fields during Desert Storm forced her into early medical retirement. The asthma attacks had become more frequent over the years, and today felt particularly heavy in her chest. The humid October air seemed to cling to her lungs like wet cotton, making each breath a conscious effort. She had just finished arranging her bags when she heard them before she saw them, three teenagers laughing loudly as they skateboarded through the parking lot with reckless abandon. The youngest couldn't have been more than 15, his oversized hoodie hanging loose on his thin frame. The other two were clearly older, probably 17 or 18, with the swagger that comes from believing you're invincible and the mistaken notion that respect is something you take rather than earn. The leader of the group, a tall kid with bleached hair and multiple piercings, was showing off on his board, weaving between parked cars with aggressive confidence. His friends cheered him on as he jumped curbs and performed tricks dangerously close to other shoppers. Margaret watched with growing concern as they narrowly missed an elderly man with a walker and caused a young mother to grab her toddler and step quickly aside. She should have gotten in her car and left. Every instinct told her to avoid confrontation, especially when her breathing was already labored. But something about their casual disregard for others triggered the same protective instinct that had made her a natural leader during her military career. These were the moments that define character, not the big, dramatic situations, but the small everyday choices between doing what's easy and doing what's right. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "You need to slow down. You're going to hurt someone." The three teenagers stopped, their boards clattering to the asphalt as they turned to stare at her. For a moment, Margaret thought they might actually listen. The youngest one looked genuinely embarrassed, his face flushing red as he realized how close they'd come to the man with the walker. But the leader's expression quickly shifted from surprise to amusement, then to something uglier. "Oh look," he said, loud enough for his friends to hear, "we got ourselves a mall cop." His friends snickered, emboldened by his mockery. "What are you gonna do, lady? Call security?" Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest begin to increase, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm asking you nicely to be more careful. There are families here, elderly people. Someone's going to get hurt." The second teenager, a stocky kid with a buzz cut who seemed eager to prove himself to his leader, stepped forward. "Maybe you should mind your own business, Grandma. We're not doing anything wrong." The stress of the confrontation was making her breathing worse. Margaret could feel the telltale signs of an attack beginning, the way her chest seemed to close up, the whistling sound that came with each exhale, the mounting panic that always made everything worse. She reached into her jacket pocket for her inhaler, trying to be discreet about it. But the movement didn't go unnoticed. The leader's eyes fixed on her hand as she pulled out the small blue device. His smile turned cruel as he recognized what it was. "Oh, what's that?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Having trouble breathing, old lady?" Margaret tried to ignore them, focusing on her inhaler. But, as she raised it to her lips, the leader moved faster than she expected. In one swift motion, he snatched the device from her hands. "Give that back," Margaret said, but her voice was already strained. The attack was coming whether she had her medication or not, and the stress of the situation was accelerating it exponentially. "This little thing?" The teenager held the inhaler up, examining it like it was some interesting artifact. "What happens if you don't get it? Do you pass out or something?" His friends laughed, but there was an uncomfortable edge to their laughter now. Even they seemed to sense that things had crossed a line from simple harassment into something more serious. Margaret's breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Each word was an effort now. "Please. I need that back, right now." The wheezing in her voice was unmistakable, and, for a split second, she saw something like doubt flicker across the youngest teenager's face. But the leader was too caught up in his power trip to back down now. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started telling us what to do," he said, tossing the inhaler casually up and down in his palm. "Seems like you've got bigger problems to worry about than us skateboarding." Margaret felt the world starting to narrow around the edges. The asthma attack was building momentum like a freight train, and, without her medication, she knew how quickly things could go from bad to catastrophic. She had been hospitalized 3 times in the past 2 years for severe attacks, and each one had been triggered by exactly this kind of stress and physical exertion. She tried to remain calm, to use the breathing techniques the doctors had taught her, but panic was setting in. The teenagers seemed to blur and shift in her vision as her body fought for oxygen. She leaned against her car, desperately trying to catch her breath. "Look, she's turning all red," the stocky kid observed with clinical detachment, as if watching a science experiment. "That's kinda gross." The youngest one stepped forward slightly. "Maybe we should give it back, Kyle. She looks really sick." But Kyle, the leader, was enjoying his moment of power too much to let it go. "She's fine. She's just being dramatic. Watch this." He held the inhaler higher, just out of Margaret's reach. "You want it back? Ask nicely. Say please." Margaret tried to speak, but only managed a harsh whisper. The effort of trying to breathe was consuming all her energy. She was beginning to experience the terrifying sensation of drowning while standing on dry land. "I can't hear you," Kyle taunted, cupping his ear in an exaggerated gesture. "You gotta speak up, Grandma." It was at that moment that Margaret realized she might actually die in this parking lot, humiliated and helpless while 3 teenagers laughed at her suffering. The thought filled her with a rage that momentarily cut through her panic. She had survived combat zones, had led soldiers through impossible situations, had earned the respect of men twice her size and half her age. And now she was going to be defeated by a punk kid with bad judgment and worse character. But rage, she quickly discovered, didn't help her breathe any better. If anything, the anger was making the attack worse. Her vision was starting to tunnel, and she could hear her heart hammering in her ears like a desperate drumbeat. She slumped further against her car, her knees beginning to buckle. That's when she saw him. Standing about 30 feet away, next to a black sedan, was a man in an unmistakable red uniform. Tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating the kind of presence that comes from years of military discipline, he had clearly been watching the entire encounter unfold. His face was a mask of controlled fury as he took in the scene, a veteran in distress, medication stolen, teenagers laughing at her suffering. The Royal Guard had arrived. Margaret had no way of knowing that Sergeant Major James Morrison was on his way home from a ceremony at the British Embassy, still wearing his full dress uniform. She didn't know that he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had personally pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles. She couldn't have known that he had zero tolerance for bullies and an absolute commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. All she knew was that someone had seen. Someone who looked like they might actually do something about it. The man in the red uniform began walking toward them with measured steps, his polished black boots clicking against the asphalt with military precision. His stride was unhurried but purposeful, like a storm that knows it doesn't need to rush because it's going to arrive exactly when it needs to. Kyle was still playing with the inhaler, completely unaware that his world was about to change dramatically. His friends were starting to notice the approaching figure, but Kyle was too absorbed in his moment of perceived triumph to pay attention to their nervous glances. Margaret used the last of her strength to lift her eyes toward her potential savior. Through the haze of her oxygen-starved vision, she could see the man's face clearly now. It was the face of someone who had seen real combat, real consequences, real life and death situations. Someone who understood the difference between harmless fun and genuine cruelty. Someone who was about to teach 3 teenagers a lesson they would never forget. As Sergeant Major Morrison closed the distance between himself and the group, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years during one of her attacks: hope. Not just hope that she would get her inhaler back, but hoped that there were still people in the world who understood that with great power comes great responsibility, even if that power is just the ability to intervene when someone needs help. The confrontation that was about to unfold would be talked about for years to come in that neighborhood. It would become the kind of story people tell to illustrate that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe sends exactly the right person to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And, sometimes that person happens to be wearing the uniform of one of the most elite military units in the world, carrying with him the weight of tradition, honor, and an uncompromising moral code that doesn't allow for the humiliation of veterans by punk kids who have no idea what real service looks like. The stage was set for a lesson in respect that would change everyone involved. Sergeant Major James Morrison had been having what most people would consider a perfect day. The ceremony at the British Embassy had gone flawlessly, honoring fallen soldiers with the dignity and respect they deserved. He had been looking forward to getting home to his wife Sarah and their 2 young daughters, perhaps grilling some burgers in the backyard while the girls played on their swing set. It was these simple moments of peace that made his service worthwhile, knowing that somewhere, families could enjoy their ordinary Tuesday afternoons because people like him stood ready to defend them. But, as he watched a teenager steal an inhaler from a clearly distressed woman, James felt his peaceful afternoon evaporate like morning mist. What he was witnessing wasn't just casual cruelty, it was assault. In his mind, there was no difference between stealing someone's inhaler and holding a gun to their head. Both actions could easily result in death. James had seen enough combat to recognize genuine distress when he saw it. The woman leaning against the Honda Civic wasn't being dramatic or seeking attention. She was fighting for her life, and 3 punk kids thought it was entertainment. The sight triggered something primal in him, the same protective instinct that had made him run into burning buildings in Kabul to pull out wounded civilians. As he approached the group, James took inventory of the situation with practiced efficiency. 3 males, teenagers, physical fitness appeared average. The leader was approximately 6 feet tall, probably 160 pounds, showing signs of aggression and poor judgment. The other 2 were followers, uncomfortable but not yet willing to challenge their leader. The victim was a woman in her early 60s, military-bearing despite her distress, experiencing what appeared to be a severe asthma attack. The tactical assessment took him less than 3 seconds. The moral assessment took even less time. Kyle was still tossing the inhaler casually from hand to hand, completely absorbed in his moment of perceived power, when a shadow fell across him. He looked up, expecting to see another concerned shopper he could intimidate or dismiss. Instead, he found himself staring at 6 feet 4 inches of military discipline in a uniform that commanded respect across the world. The Royal Guard uniform was unmistakable, the red tunic with its intricate golden braiding, the perfectly pressed black trousers with their razor-sharp creases, the polished buttons that reflected the afternoon sun like mirrors. But, it wasn't the uniform that made Kyle's smirk fade instantly. It was the man wearing it. Sergeant Major Morrison had the presence that only comes from leading men in life-or-death situations. His steel-gray eyes held the weight of experience and the absolute certainty of someone who had never backed down from a fight worth fighting. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made career soldiers snap to attention without thinking. "Son," he said, the single word cutting through the air like a blade, "you're going to return that medication to the lady immediately." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact about what was going to happen next. Kyle felt his mouth go dry, but 17 years of unchecked arrogance don't disappear instantly, even when faced with overwhelming opposition. His teenage brain, still developing the capacity for long-term thinking and risk assessment, made the catastrophically poor decision to double down. "Or what?" Kyle asked, trying to inject bravado into his voice. "You gonna arrest me?" "I don't think mall security has that kind of authority." The 2 friends exchanged worried glances. Even through their adolescent haze, they could recognize that this wasn't some minimum-wage security guard they could intimidate. This was something else entirely, something that made their survival instincts start screaming warnings they weren't quite mature enough to fully understand. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took one more step forward, closing the distance between himself and Kyle to about 3 feet. At this range, the difference in their size and presence became overwhelming. Kyle had to crane his neck back to maintain eye contact, and, for the first time, he began to realize he might have seriously miscalculated. "That woman," James said, his voice never rising above a conversational level but somehow carrying more menace than any shout could have achieved, "is a United States Army veteran. Those ribbons on her jacket indicate she served in Desert Storm. She put her life on the line defending the freedoms that allow you to skateboard safely through parking lots without worrying about suicide bombers or sniper fire." Kyle glanced quickly at Margaret, noticing for the first time the military decorations on her jacket that his teenage self-absorption had completely overlooked. The Bronze Star, the Combat Medical Badge, the Desert Campaign ribbon, symbols that meant nothing to him but everything to the man standing before him. "Right now," James continued, "she is experiencing a medical emergency, and you are preventing her from receiving life-saving medication. In my country, we would call that attempted murder. In this country, it's called assault with intent to cause bodily harm. Both carry significant prison sentences." The stocky teenager took a nervous step backward. "Look, man, we were just messing around. We didn't mean anything by it." James's gaze shifted to him for just a moment, and the kid felt like he was being evaluated by a predator deciding whether he was worth the effort of hunting. "You didn't mean anything by it," James repeated slowly. "You were just messing around while a combat veteran slowly suffocates in front of you." "I see." Behind them, Margaret was still struggling to breathe, but she was watching the interaction with growing fascination despite her distress. She had seen plenty of military discipline during her career, but this man was operating on a different level entirely. He wasn't just angry, he was methodically dismantling three teenagers' worldview without raising his voice or making a single threatening gesture. The youngest of the three, the one who had shown some conscience earlier, finally found his voice. "Kyle, give her the thing back. This is getting weird." But Kyle's pride was now at war with his growing fear, and pride was still winning by a narrow margin. "I'm not scared of some toy soldier in a fancy costume. What's he gonna do, march me to death?" It was perhaps the worst possible thing he could have said. James's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made all three teenagers instinctively take a step backward. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "This uniform," he said, "represents His Majesty's Grenadier Guards, one of the oldest and most elite military units in the world. I have served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places whose names are classified. I have been personally decorated for valor by 3 different heads of state. And I have never, in my entire career, allowed a bully to harm someone under my protection." He paused, letting that sink in. "Today will not be the first time." Kyle's hand was shaking now as he continued to hold the inhaler, but his teenage brain was still convinced he could somehow salvage his dignity from this situation. "You can't touch me. I know my rights. This is assault if you lay a hand on me." James smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just heard his opponent make a critical tactical error. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I cannot and will not assault you. However, I can and will exercise my rights as a witness to a felony in progress." He pulled out his phone with one smooth motion. "I've been recording this entire interaction. I have clear video evidence of you stealing medical equipment from a disabled veteran during a health emergency. I also have your face, your voice, and, depending on what information your friends might share with police, probably your full name and address within the hour." Kyle's face went pale as the reality of modern technology and social media consequences crashed into his adolescent consciousness like a freight train. "But here's what's going to happen," James continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone laying out terms that weren't negotiable. "You're going to return that inhaler immediately. You're going to apologize to this veteran for your inexcusable behavior. And then, you're going to leave this parking lot and spend some serious time thinking about what kind of man you want to become." The stocky friend was pulling on Kyle's sleeve now. "Dude, just give it back. My dad will kill me if he finds out I was involved in something like this." But James wasn't finished. "Alternatively, I can send this video to the police, post it on social media with your faces clearly visible, and let the world decide what they think of 3 teenagers bullying a combat veteran. In my experience, the internet tends to be quite creative in its responses to this kind of behavior. The youngest teenager was already backing away toward his skateboard.
I'm out, man. This is insane.
Just give her the inhaler back. For the first time since the confrontation began, Kyle seemed to truly understand the depth of the hole he had dug for himself. The inhaler suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hand. Behind James, Margaret was still struggling to breathe, her face now showing the grayish pallor that indicated her body was being starved of oxygen. She's really sick, the stocky kid said, genuine concern finally breaking through his adolescent callousness.
Kyle, look at her. She can't breathe.
Kyle looked at Margaret for the first time since stealing her inhaler, really looked at her, and saw not an authority figure to rebel against but a human being in genuine distress. The same protective instinct that should have guided his behavior from the beginning finally flickered to life, helped along by the presence of a man who represented everything Kyle secretly hoped he might become someday.
I didn't think.
Kyle started, his voice small and uncertain.
No, James agreed, you didn't think. But you have an opportunity to start thinking right now. The question is, what kind of person are you going to choose to be?
The parking lot had fallen silent except for Margaret's labored breathing and the distant sound of traffic. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this moment would resolve itself. Kyle looked down at the inhaler in his hand, then at Margaret's desperate face, then back at the imposing figure in the red uniform who had somehow managed to strip away all his false confidence and show him exactly who he really was underneath the bravado. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present knew that whatever happened next would echo through these teenagers' lives for years to come. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with tension and possibility. Kyle stared down at the small blue inhaler in his palm, and, for the first time in his 17 years, he truly understood the weight of consequence. This wasn't like the other times he'd gotten in trouble: detention for talking back to teachers, grounding for missing curfew, lectures from his parents about responsibility. This was different. This was real. Margaret's breathing had become increasingly desperate, each wheeze sounding like sandpaper against wood. Her lips were taking on a bluish tinge that James recognized immediately from his medical training. She was entering the dangerous phase of an asthma attack where the lack of oxygen begins to affect brain function and cardiac rhythm. Time was running out, and everyone in the parking lot could sense it. The youngest teenager, Danny, had already made his choice. He dropped his skateboard and stepped completely away from his friends.
This is messed up, man. I'm calling my mom.
His voice cracked with genuine fear as he pulled out his phone, not to record or text, but to seek the guidance of an adult he trusted. The stocky kid, Marcus, was torn between loyalty to his friend and the growing realization that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Kyle, seriously, just give it back.
Look at her, dude. She's turning blue.
But Kyle was experiencing something that psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that occurs when someone's actions conflict with their values.
He wasn't a bad kid, not really.
He volunteered at his church's food bank every month, helped his elderly neighbor with her groceries, and had never intentionally hurt anyone in his life. But he had also spent the last 2 years building an identity around being tough, around not backing down, around proving that he wasn't the scared little kid he'd been when his parents divorced. Now, faced with a man who represented real strength, the kind that comes from genuine courage and moral conviction rather than false bravado, Kyle was seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time.
And he didn't like what he saw.
James watched the internal struggle play out across the teenager's face with something approaching sympathy. He had been 17 once, had made his share of poor decisions, had felt the desperate need to prove himself in ways that now seemed foolish and dangerous. But he had also learned something that these kids were just discovering, that real strength comes from knowing when to admit you're wrong. "Son," James said quietly, his voice gentle for the first time since the confrontation began, "I can see you're a better person than this moment suggests. But that woman is running out of time, and you have the power to save her life."
That's not a small thing. That's the kind of moment that defines who you really are.
Margaret tried to speak, to tell them she needed help, but she could only manage a weak whisper. The attack was now consuming so much of her energy that she was beginning to slide down the side of her car, her legs no longer able to support her weight.
The sight of her obvious distress finally broke through Kyle's remaining resistance.
With shaking hands, Kyle took a step toward Margaret.
Then, another.
James moved aside, giving him room but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. The teenager's face was pale with shock as he realized how seriously ill she had become during his moment of stubborn pride.
"Ma'am," Kyle said, his voice barely audible, "I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry." He held out the inhaler with both hands, like an offering.
Margaret's eyes met his as she reached for her medication, and Kyle saw something there that hit him harder than any punishment could have, not anger, but disappointment. Disappointment in his generation, in his choices, in the kind of world where veterans could be terrorized by the very people they had served to protect. She managed to activate the inhaler and take her first dose of medication, the relief visible on her face as the bronchodilator began to work. But it would take several minutes for the full effect, and James could see she was still in significant distress. "Call 911, he commanded, and Danny immediately complied, his hands shaking as he dialed.
James knelt beside Margaret, his medical training kicking in automatically. "Ma'am, my name is Sergeant Major Morrison. I have combat medical experience. Can you tell me how long you've been having this attack?"
Margaret tried to answer but could only nod and hold up her fingers to indicate time. James checked her pulse, noted her color, and began the systematic assessment that had saved lives in far more hostile environments than a suburban parking lot. Kyle stood frozen, watching as the man in the red uniform efficiently coordinated Margaret's care while his friends provided support.
Danny was on the phone with emergency services, clearly and calmly providing information.
Marcus was directing traffic around them to ensure the paramedics would have clear access. And Kyle felt utterly useless, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force.
"Can I do something?" Kyle asked desperately. "Is there something I can do to help?"
James looked up at him, and Kyle was surprised to see something like compassion in the older man's eyes.
"You can learn from this," James said simply.
"You can make sure this never happens again, to anyone, anywhere." The wail of sirens was growing closer now, and Margaret's breathing was gradually improving as her medication took effect. She managed to speak for the first time in several minutes, her voice weak but clear.
"Thank you," she whispered to James. Then, incredibly, she looked at Kyle. "All of you. Thank you for helping."
Kyle felt tears stinging his eyes. Even after everything he had put her through, she was thanking him. The grace of her response hit him like a physical blow, and he suddenly understood something about real strength, real character, that no amount of posturing or bravado could ever achieve. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, taking over Margaret's care with the kind of calm competence that comes from years of experience. James provided them with a clear, concise briefing on her condition and the timeline of events, his military bearing evident even in this civilian emergency.
As the medical team worked, a police officer approached the group.
James had anticipated this and had his phone ready with the video recording he had mentioned earlier. But, instead of pressing charges, something unexpected happened. Margaret, now breathing more easily with the help of supplemental oxygen, asked to speak with the officer. In a voice that was still strained but growing stronger, she said something that surprised everyone present.
"Officer, I don't want to press charges.
These boys made a mistake, but they learned from it.
Sometimes that's more valuable than punishment."
The officer looked skeptical.
"Ma'am, stealing medical equipment during an emergency is a serious crime. You could have died."
"But I didn't," Margaret replied firmly. "And I think these young men understand now what their actions could have led to.
I was their age once. I made mistakes too.
Someone gave me a second chance, and it changed my life."
Kyle could hardly believe what he was hearing.
This woman, whom he had tormented and nearly killed through his thoughtless cruelty, was advocating for mercy. It was a display of character so profound that it shattered every defense mechanism he had built up over the years. James watched the exchange with growing respect for Margaret's wisdom. He had seen enough combat to know that sometimes the most powerful weapon is compassion, that mercy can accomplish things that force never could. However, Margaret continued, looking directly at Kyle, I do think some community service might be appropriate. Perhaps working with veterans or at the hospital.
Understanding what service really means. The officer nodded slowly.
I think that can be arranged, assuming these young men are willing to accept the terms.
Kyle stepped forward immediately. Yes, sir. Whatever she thinks is right. I'll do it.
Marcus and Danny quickly agreed as well, both clearly relieved that they wouldn't be facing criminal charges but also genuinely moved by Margaret's unexpected forgiveness. James felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with his own actions. He was witnessing something that military training couldn't teach, the kind of moral courage that transforms enemies into allies, that builds bridges instead of walls. As the paramedics prepared to transport Margaret to the hospital for observation, she asked James to come closer. Sergeant Major, she said quietly, thank you for seeing.
Thank you for caring enough to get involved.
Ma'am, James replied with a crisp nod, it was my honor.
Thank you for your service.
She smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her that day.
Thank you for yours.
As the ambulance pulled away, Kyle approached James with obvious trepidation. The teenager's cocky demeanor had been completely stripped away, leaving behind someone who looked very young and very uncertain. Sir, Kyle said, his voice shaking slightly, I know I don't deserve any advice from you, but how do I make this right?
How do I become someone like you instead of someone like what I was today?
James studied the young man for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes that hadn't been there an hour earlier, genuine remorse, real desire for change, the beginning of wisdom that comes from understanding consequences. The fact that you're asking that question, James said finally, tells me you're already on the right path. Real strength isn't about dominating others or proving how tough you are. It's about using whatever power you have to protect people who can't protect themselves. He paused, looking at all three teenagers who were listening intently to every word. That woman forgave you today not because your actions were acceptable, but because she sees potential in you that you haven't seen in yourselves yet. Don't waste that gift. Become the kind of men who would have stepped in to help her if you'd been bystanders instead of the aggressors. Kyle nodded solemnly, and James could see that the lesson had taken hold in a way that no lecture or punishment could have achieved. As the crowd began to disperse and the teenagers gathered their skateboards to leave, Kyle turned back one more time.
Sir? Will you tell me how to find her?
Mrs. the lady. I want to visit her, to apologize properly when she's feeling better.
James smiled for the first time that afternoon.
I think she would like that. Her name is Margaret Chen, and I suspect she'll be at the VA hospital for follow-up care.
They can probably help you get in touch.
As the three boys walked away, their shoulders heavy with new understanding, James reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He had left the house that morning expecting to attend a ceremony and return home for a quiet evening with his family. Instead, he had become part of a story that would probably be told and retold for years to come, a reminder that heroism isn't always about grand gestures or battlefield courage. Sometimes it's just about being willing to step up when someone needs help, regardless of whether anyone will ever know or care about what you did. And, sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to witness the moment when someone discovers who they really want to be. 3 days after the incident at Henderson's Market, Kyle Henderson stood outside the Veterans Affairs Medical Center holding a bouquet of flowers that suddenly seemed inadequate for what he was trying to accomplish. His mother, Susan, waited in the car, watching her son with a mixture of pride and concern as he struggled with nerves that were entirely new to him. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of difficult conversations, self-reflection, and the kind of emotional growth that typically takes years to achieve. After leaving the parking lot that Tuesday, Kyle had gone home and told his parents everything. Not the sanitized version he might have shared a week earlier, but the raw, uncomfortable truth about what he had done and how close he had come to seriously hurting someone. His father, a construction foreman who sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday afternoon can become the day that restores your faith in humanity. Sometimes a simple trip to the grocery store becomes a reminder that heroes walk among us, often unnoticed, until the moment they're needed most. This is the story of what happens when cruelty meets courage, when bullies pick the wrong target, and when someone who has dedicated their life to protecting others finds themselves in need of protection. What started as teenage mischief in a parking lot would end with a lesson in respect that none of them would ever forget. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the courts or the police, sometimes it comes wearing the unmistakable red uniform of the Royal Guard, carrying decades of discipline, honor, and an unshakable moral code. This is a story about breathing, about the desperate fight for air that every asthma sufferer knows, and about the breath of relief that comes when you realize that good people still exist in this world. It's about split-second decisions, unexpected heroes, and the kind of intervention that makes you believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe has a way of balancing things out. Sit back and prepare to witness what happens when respect meets disrespect head-on, and when a veteran's worst moment becomes the catalyst for something extraordinary.